Chapter 1. The Law No One Young. Believed by the time the fifth spiral, Concord had existed for 3,000 years. Most of its younger member civilizations had begun treating the old warnings of the elder species the way prosperous. People always treat inherited caution as relics of a harsher age, interesting for ceremony, perhaps worthy of a respectful nod at festivals, but fundamentally unsuited to the bold efficiencies of the present. The Concord was vast now, glittering across trade lanes and diplomatic sectors in a weave of agreements, arbitration halls shared, science enclaves, and military non-aggression pacts that gave many of its citizens the illusion that history had matured past the need for fear. 2. The young, especially those born inside secure inner systems where food moved on, time and war appeared mainly in archives. The galaxy felt navigable, dangerous in pockets perhaps, but knowable. The great predators of prior ages had either been absorbed, humbled, or regulated into etiquette. Ancient machine plagues had been sealed behind event horizons of law and fire. Crusades had burned out, blood dynasties had gone bureaucratic. Even humanity, that strange and quietly unsettling species from the old blue world near the Orion fractures, had become, at least in the polite official language, one respected power among many. They traded heavily, voted irregularly, intervened rarely, and maintained a military posture so disciplined it almost seemed disinterested to younger species that looked suspiciously like normality. The ancient elders knew better. They always did. Across the Concord there survived a handful of civilizations old enough to remember eras before the current peace, species whose recorded memory reached so far back that pre-Concord for them did not mean one dark founding war, but 1,000 local extinctions, salvage empires, broken stars, and desperate alliances formed under skies still wet with debris. These elders were not united in culture, religion, biology, or aesthetics. Some were aquatic, synodic minds who lived in tidal megastructures around dim suns. Some were tall, bone-white archivists from old gravity wells who encoded history in living crystal grown through their own nervous systems. Some were avian philosopher clans whose dead were remembered as weather patterns in ceremonial atmosphere domes. They disagreed on most things. They had fought one another, traded with one another, judged one another with weary sophistication, and learned over ages how to compress survival into principle. Of all the laws, warnings, and advisories preserved in their oldest joint councils, only one appeared almost verbatim across every civilizational root archive that mentioned humans directly. Never defy them, not never offend them, though wise statesmen oft took the phrase that way for practical reasons. Not never fight them, because the elders understood that history does not always allow such clean avoidance. Not never oppose their policy, because humanity, like any power, had policies worth opposing. The law was more specific and therefore more terrifying. Never defy them. The word in its oldest cross-translation did not mean disagreement. It meant that precise species of arrogance by which one identifies a clearly stated human line, understands that they will enforce it, and decides to violate it anyway, because one believes their response can be delayed, managed, or survived more profitably than obedience. It was not a moral law. It was not born of reverence. It was an empirical law, like not venting a reactor core into your own air. system. The elders taught it because they had lived long enough to see what happened to those who thought human. Patience meant softness, human. Compromise meant weakness, and human. Proportionality meant safety once the line had truly been crossed. The younger species laughed at this when they thought the elders could not hear. On the market world of Salvaris, where silver towers floated above, methane-cooled canals and 3 moons turned trade tariffs into a civic religion, the old law became a joke among academy candidates and merchant heirs. Never defy them, they would say, in exaggerated elder tones whenever one of their instructors warned them about over-leveraging a contract. The phrase had become, in certain circles, shorthand for outdated caution, a proverb invoked whenever someone wished to mock old fear without admitting they found the old stories compelling. Humanity, after all, did not seem mythic. Up close, their diplomats came to the conquered in tailored jackets instead of conquest armor. Their ambassadors drank station coffee and argued over procedural language. Their merchants could be haggled with. Their warships, though undeniably powerful, did not parade as if the galaxy were a stage built for their intimidation. Younger observers saw all this and concluded that the elders had mistaken historical contingency for species essence. Yes, perhaps humans had once been especially formidable during some savage expansion, century or extinction war, but now they looked like everyone else under enough paperwork. It was on Salvaris that the trouble began. The Salvari Dominion was not technically a military empire, though this distinction mattered mainly to Salvari public relations offices. In practice, it was a trade hegemony with enough fleet power to ensure its contracts were interpreted in the profitable direction, and enough cultural vanity to believe such coercion counted as sophistication rather than force. They prized elegance, strategic debt, and the ability to make weaker systems surrender through numbers so complicated they mistook them for fate. Their current archon, Terrasul, was young by dynastic standards, brilliant in logistics, adored by the high houses, and profoundly susceptible to the one flaw that has ruined more civilizations than plague. He genuinely believed history's great warnings had all been written about people less intelligent than himself. When he heard the elders repeat the law at the Centennial Council, again with all their irritating solemnity, he did not feel fear. He felt challenged. In private salons he began asking the kinds of questions that seduce ambitious minds into ruin. Why did the elders still speak of humanity as if they were exempt from ordinary power balancing? Why did no one test the myth anymore? Had not the humans become dependent on trade webs, diplomatic optics, and coalition legitimacy like any other mature civilization? Were they not vulnerable precisely because of their reputation to control defiance that would expose the gap between legend and current capacity? These questions reached others who should have known better and instead found them intoxicating. Among the younger fleet theorists there grew a school of thought that the old human deterrence profile was largely psychological residue. The elders, they claimed, had lived through humanity's more expansionist, blood-soaked centuries and never adjusted emotionally to the modern Terran style of restrained intervention and measured legalism. To hear these theorists tell it, the law never defy them was less a strategic principle than inherited trauma. The Salvari need not Attack humanity directly, such primitive thinking was for war species and failing. Powers, no, they could do something much smarter, something civilized, they could. Defy a human red line in a deniable, economically rational, technically limited way and see whether the humans responded with the apocalyptic certainty of elder myth or the constrained hesitation of every modern power, dependent on layered consensus. If the latter, the Dominion would have learned something priceless, that humanity's greatest weapon was memory alone. Once memory was punctured, every younger state in the conquered would renegotiate around the new reality. The line they chose to test was a terrible one. Humanity had, for over a century, maintained protected sanctuary corridors for displaced species in the rimward reaches. Officially, these were civilian, humanitarian zones under multi-species charter, but everyone important knew the truth beneath the paperwork. They existed because humans had once watched too many refugee peoples turned into market inventory, political leverage, or polite extinction, while the respectable powers debated language. The sanctuaries were open to approved fleeing populations, medically shielded and neutral in theory. In practice, they remained neutral because everyone understood humanity would react disproportionately to anyone who preyed upon them. Human ships escorted food there. Human med platforms rotated through them. Human law officers oversaw transport manifests with the same rigid attention they gave war crimes tribunals. The sanctuaries were not rich, they were not glamorous, but they were protected in the old, frightening sense. A line had been drawn, named clearly, and attached to an emotional category. Humans did not negotiate around. The Salvari did not raid the sanctuaries openly. That would have been too stupid even for the intoxicated. Instead, they moved against the supply architecture around them. First came fees, then custom slowdowns, then dead instruments targeting independent haulers who serviced the corridors, then legal seizures of irregular cargo that just happened to include pediatric med, gel, climate tents, and desalination coils bound for the shelters. The Dominion framed the whole campaign as anti-smuggling reform. Their ambassadors smiled, their advocates produced ledgers, their analysts praised the elegance of pressure over force. No refugee was shot publicly, no sanctuary dome was bombed. They were simply starved, delayed, and administratively thinned by a system designed to make compassion too expensive to maintain. It was, from the Salvari perspective, the perfect test of the law. They would not attack humanity. They would merely defy the human guarantee and see if the great old warning still had teeth. At the next Centennial Council, Elder Mother Sarah of the Glass Tide, one of the few beings alive who had personally watched the end of the Lyrian Wars, heard the Salvari presentation on corridor regularization. Without interrupting once, she was nearly translucent with age, her body suspended in a flowing support prism of warm mineral fluid, and when she spoke, younger delegates often mistook her softness for weakness because they had never seen a truly ancient being conserve energy for the few words that mattered. "You are defying them," she said. Arcantarav smiled with all the confidence of a man who believed language could still save him from reality. "We are enforcing lawful economic order," he answered. "No Terran vessel has been fired upon, no human territory breached. If their concern is truly humanitarian, they may simply meet the regulations like everyone else. Murmur moved through the younger delegations. It was a clever answer. It was also to the elders the exact shape of the mistake. Sareth's old eyes did not leave him. No, she said again, and now even the younger species stopped shifting in their seats. You are identifying what they protect, touching it on purpose, and trusting civility to delay consequence. That is defiance. The hall stayed silent long enough that the climate systems became audible. Then Archon Terev, radiant and polished, silver and confidence, made the choice history had been waiting for. Then he said, perhaps the law deserves to be tested somewhere in the old observer. Tears, an elder species delegate, made the ritual sign against self-destruction. The younger ones noticed and laughed later. They did not laugh for very long. Chapter 2. The first answer was not war. The thing that most doomed the Selvari dominion in the beginning was how ordinary the first human response looked. No fleet clouds gathered over Selvaris, no martial declaration lit the core networks, no Terran admiral issued a threat in a voice sharpened for legend. For 11 full days after the council exchange, it seemed possible, especially to the young and the arrogant, that Archon Terev's cell had been right. Human delegates condemned the corridor seizures in the usual language. Aid groups filed protests. Legal counter-petitions moved through the conquered courts. Human media ran stories from the sanctuary domes. Children with salt rash from broken desal units, medics rationing thermal packs, old teachers keeping lesson circles going beneath failing lamps. It was moving, distressing politically, damaging perhaps, but not the shape of doom the elders had warned about. In the Selvari high salon, the confidence turned celebratory. Investors whispered of a new era in which Terran taboos might finally be treated as negotiable. Young admirals laughed openly at the ancient law. Never defy them, they said, over crystal and drink, unless one has proper accountants. The elders did not celebrate with them. On the third day, Elder Mother Sareth requested emergency transit out of Selvari controlled space. On the fourth, 3 old species trade houses quietly froze all future long-duration investments tied to Dominion outer lane security. On the fifth, a coalition of veteran-free captains rerouted around Selvari customs nodes despite the cost. None of this made headlines. That was the problem. The inexperienced always think cataclysm announces itself through trumpets. Real collapse often begins with the sort of people who understand consequences simply deciding not to stand too close. When the beam starts to crack, humanity's first true move came through law. That should not have surprised anyone who knew them. Humans were not elders, but they were old enough in interstellar terms to understand the uses of sequence. They did not begin with vengeance, because vengeance without architecture is only spectacle. Instead, the Terran Assembly passed the Sanctuary Continuity Act under emergency humanitarian authority. On paper it was dry, almost boring, a framework for direct state underwriting of sanctioned relief, protection of registered sanctuary logistics as Terran humanitarian extension routes, and automatic classification of interference with such routes as an assault on protected Terran administered civil corridors. The wording was meticulous and chilling in the way only human legal language can be when the species is no Longer trying to be liked, the act did not threaten Silvaris. It did something more dangerous. It erased ambiguity. Every station master, shipping guild, insurer, fuel cooperative, security, house and peripheral government in 4 sectors now had written notice that touching the refugee corridors did not merely involve them in a trade dispute. It placed them on the wrong side of an active Terran protection architecture. The second move came through economics. Terran systems and allied trade blocs began rerouting, freezing, reclassifying, and recalling in patterns so broad and so disciplined that Selvari analysts initially mistook them for technical turbulence. Contract insurers stopped covering vessels that accepted Dominion interdiction warrants. Human-built agricultural processors suspended priority exports to Selvari. Interior markets, port labor unions on 3 neutral worlds voted to refuse loading or refit services for any ship carrying seizure orders against sanctuary freight, a move entirely legal under their charters once the Terran Act had recategorized the issue as protected. Humanitarian transit, spare parts got harder to source, fuel premiums rose. Arbitration courts that usually favored the highest bidder suddenly became prickly about Dominion claims. Even the black markets became less friendly. Human displeasure, if properly organized, had a way of making the legal and illegal sectors alike develop unexpected standards. Still no warships came. That was what fooled Tarav and his inner circle most thoroughly. They had expected either immediate violence or continued speeches. What they received instead was a tightening field of consequence so broad that it hardly seemed personal until one woke and found 10 small assumptions about trade, access, and impunity had all stopped working at once. It irritated them. It did not frighten them. They were still measuring the matter as economics and prestige. They thought time remained theirs. Then the first convoy broke through, not broke through in the military sense. No triumphant battles, no smash blockades broadcast across the stars, rather under the new Terran Act and the quietly shifting loyalties of everyone who preferred not to be caught too near a human red line. 6 massive relief flotillas entered the rimward reaches under registered humanitarian escort, not Navy hulls, not technically builders, med ships, water carriers, seed vaults, school modules, and transport tenders under legal civilian protection, each one flying the new sanctuary designation and a simple line and trade standard beneath it. Interfere and be known. Selvari customs officers attempted the first seizure at Gate Station Oriole. The station master refused docking clearance when the officers threatened charter penalties. The station master is recorded as saying, "You may issue whatever penalties you like after the human stop looking directly at us." She then resigned publicly and opened the corridor. The second seizure attempt ended worse. A Dominion patrol cutter boarded a small Terran relief ship in the outer Issel lanes, detained the medical manifest officer, and attempted to impound pediatric climate medication for inventory verification. 8 hours later, every financial account tied to the cutter's captain, his ship broker, and the 2 customs houses that processed his warrants had been frozen. Across half the Concord, 20 hours later, the cutter itself was found adrift, stripped of fuel with its crew alive, unharmed and locked in their own brig, beneath a message projected onto the Command glass in 12 languages. Do not touch the children again. That was the first point at which fear entered. Silvari command in honest form. Archon. Tarav still resisted it publicly. He called the incident piracy, then illegal. Coercion, then theatrical overreach by a species too emotionally entangled in refugee theatrics to respect sovereign order but inside the dominion. Ministries, older officials began looking over the old war archives and finding to their dismay that the elders' language matched too well human. Retaliation did not always begin with fleet fire. Sometimes it began with a single note slipped under the door of your assumptions, a legal act, a cargo corridor, a vanished patrol cutter. Message written in the perfect tone for making future dread feel embarrassingly rational. The real turning point came at Sanctuary Ring the Rose. Their rose was one of the largest refugee habitats in the protected corridor web, crowded beyond design limit with 6 displaced populations and operating on supply margins so thin that every delayed shipment translated immediately into sickness. Silvari enforcement had spent weeks pressuring the ring indirectly, slowing water imports, holding membrane stock, impounding nutrient gel on claims of contamination review. When conditions inside the ring worsened enough to make headlines across Terran space, pressure mounted inside the human political system for a harder response. This too the young Silvari celebrated. At first, let the humans become emotional, they said. Let them overextend. Let them reveal the legends. Emptiness through impulsive action. What arrived at the Rose was not impulsive. It was a convoy so vast that station children later thought for a few breathless minutes that a second moon had joined the dark. 37 Terran civil halls, modular atmosphere barges, water stackers, fabrication rigs, hospital cylinders, agricultural reef seeders, school habitats, and around them not one war fleet but a patrol screen large enough to make every sensor operator in the region understand that if conflict started here, it would not remain local. The lead human ship transmitted one message to all channels before docking. Commenced, we are restoring supply. We will, with civilian relief after this. Transmission does so with full knowledge of our position. The words were almost gentle, that more than anything terrified the elder observers, because the old law had never meant that humans struck first in rage. It meant that once they had made the line visible enough for no one to mistake it, defiance became self-selected destruction. The elders watching the Rose knew that if the Silvari touched the convoy now, the phase of warning would be over. History would become practical. Sarith herself transmitted once more to the Dominion court. No threat, no sermon, only the law, this time unadorned by explanation. Never defy them. Archon Tarav laughed when he heard it. Then he ordered the interdiction anyway. And all across the older species relay nets, those who still remembered the first human wars closed their ledgers, recalled their descendants, and stepped back from the blast radius of a civilization about to learn why some laws survive, because no one who breaks them remains intact enough to argue afterward. Chapter 3: The Meaning of the Law. The first Silvari warship to fire onto the Rose relief convoy did not last long enough for its own admiral to finish the second command sentence of the engagement. Its opening lance strike sheared through the shield web of a civilian water carrier and wood, under ordinary assumptions, have marked the beginning of a contained border skirmish, with humanitarian outrage layered on top. Instead, the ship's sensors flooded with signatures so suddenly that the tactical record later looked almost fraudulent, as if the universe had developed a moral opinion and armed it. Terran patrol ships that had been holding distance as if politely unsure of their own invitation snapped into predatory geometry, hidden range kill nodes lit from the dust shadow behind. The Rose, a pair of dark hulls later identified as deep response cruisers from human colonial security, emerged from silent running position so close to the Salvari forward line that the first officer on the cruiser Bright adjudication reportedly screamed before the bridge cut out. The patrol screen did not roar, it did not posture. It killed with the concentrated speed of a system finally permitted to stop, pretending the conversation could remain diplomatic. By the time the survivors in the second line realized the engagement was not local, not containable, and not at all what Arcantariv had promised. For Dominion warships were gone, and the relief convoy had already resumed docking under full protection. The war that followed lasted less than 2 years, which by interstellar standards counts as both short and devastating. That brevity misleads later readers. They imagine a swift, decisive punishment campaign, a great power slapping down an insolent trade empire. The truth was more terrible and more instructive. The Salvari were not militarily weak. Their fleets were disciplined, their logistics good, and their home systems rich enough to sustain prolonged conflict. They had every structural advantage that should have made Defiance survivable, if not victorious. What they lacked was the one thing the elders had understood better than anyone. They had crossed from disagreement into moral activation. The humans were no longer defending a trade principle, a treaty clause, or a diplomatic preference. They were defending people under their protection. Children, med wards, exhausted species in temporary shelters who had believed the corridor promises because someone had to. Once humans define a war that way, they become extremely difficult to discourage because the conflict stops being about political outcome and starts being about internal species coherence. To retreat too early from such a conflict would wound their own self-conception, and humans, for all their sophistication, remain profoundly dangerous when identity and obligation. Few, the Salvari, discovered this first. In the lanes, Terran retaliation did not focus on glorious set-piece engagements, except where necessary. Instead, it worked like precision weather, shipping denied, insurance voided, border courts turned hostile overnight, labor unions in neutral stations suddenly developed absolute policy clarity about Dominion. Frayed mercenary houses that might once have balanced the odds simply refused every Salvari contract connected to the war, often with mocking language. Now preserved in archive, one famous refusal from the Varric Pike Brotherhood. Read, "We are killers, not historians of our own extinction." Another from the Iron Cinders fleet was even shorter. No one sane fights the humans after the children are involved, even pirate republics became unreliable partners because raiding Terran or corridor shipping in that phase of the war no longer felt like opportunism. It felt like volunteering for future excavation. The Dominion had enough ships to keep Fighting, yes, but increasingly they had to fuel, arm, repair, insure, and crew those ships in a galaxy that had begun quietly placing distance between itself and the kind of stupidity the Salvari had chosen. The second lesson came on the ground. The Salvari had not intended a grand occupation war. That, too, made their suffering instructive. They had expected pressure, seizures, legal leverage, perhaps some strategic demonstrations near the sanctuary. Routes, instead, as Terran operations widened, they found themselves defending stations, trade worlds, and extraction hubs that had never been designed as battlefields because the Empire's confidence had once made such designs seem unnecessary. Terran Marines and colonial security units struck with an intimacy the Dominion could neither predict nor emotionally absorb. Not cities burned for spectacle, not populations butchered for fear, no. Something an empire built on managerial cruelty. The humans kept cutting out the parts that made the system function, while going out of their way to evacuate civilians first. Port authority databases vanished, debt vaults opened, child labor registries were exposed to every network willing to look, prison compounds emptied, shelter populations in subject systems suddenly found human food drops and legal charters waiting where their governors had promised only eventual review. Dominion commanders who expected to rally local populations against Terran violence instead watched those populations step aside, remain neutral, or actively help the attackers, because for too long the Salvari had mistaken administrative suffering for invisible suffering. Humanity noticed the invisible, humanity often weaponized that notice. Arkan Terov kept insisting the war remained winnable. In public he called it a tragic overreaction by a younger species too governed by sentiment. In private he raged at admirals, punished cautious ministers, and rewrote campaign maps with the furious precision of a man who believed enough red arrows could force reality to apologize. The court around him thinned, not through direct execution at first, but through the more telling symptoms of elite fear, families leaving for ancestral estates, private treasuries, moving off-world, dynastic marriages postponed, old allies becoming hard to reach on secure channels. Those who had laughed at the elders' law most openly now stopped mentioning the elders at all. Silence is often the first tribute pride pays to truth. Yet one old minister keeper had ran of the tides. Archive did speak near the end. He stood before the War Council, ancient enough to remember his own grandmother reciting the law during the famine roots of an earlier century, and said to Terov with exhausted contempt, "You thought never defy them meant worship. It meant arithmetic. Enough others learned the equation before you." The phrase "the equation" entered the historical record because it explained so much. To the elders the law had never been mystical. Humans were not invincible. They bled, erred, quarreled, and often acted too slowly at first. Entire archives recorded human defeats, humiliations, and unfinished wars. Point was not that they could not be hurt, it was that certain provocations transformed the relationship between their moral imagination and their industrial capacity in ways that made ordinary strategic calculations worthless. Most powers count costs and benefits. Humans, once deeply activated, start counting obligations and identities instead. If a war enters that Register, they will mobilize allies they did not even know were allies. Reconfigure civilian economies with frightening speed and tolerate burdens that more stable species would reject as irrational. The elders had seen this too. Many times they had distilled it into law, and not because humans were gods, but because reality had shown a strong preference for destroying anyone arrogant enough to test the pattern. Directly, the final unraveling of the Selvari dominion happened in its own core system, as all true consequences eventually do. Terran fleets did not storm Vale Toroth in dramatic vengeance. They did something more human and more lasting. They broke the sanctuary. Interdiction first, then the outer lanes, then the insurance spine, then the dead architecture, then the subject world loyalty matrix, then the internal myth of inevitability. By the time the first human warships appeared in visible orbit over the capital, the real collapse had already happened. Outer provinces were withholding tribute. Merchant houses were bargaining separately with Terran mediators to preserve partial continuity. Client species were reopening old language schools and local militias. Behaviors that sound small unless one understands that empires die from the bottom up. Once enough people no longer believe that center can protect them, even then the humans offered terms. That was another thing the young had misunderstood. Humanity was not eager for annihilation. They were eager for coherence, release every corridor and sanctuary claim, restore seized assets, surrender all officers and ministers tied to the Darrow's interdiction and related corridor, starvation policies, establish reparations, open archives, submit to supervised reconstruction accords. Terms were ruinous, humiliating, and absolutely survivable. Tarov refused. He refused because by then he could not distinguish between his own pride and the state. That confusion is the private religion of doomed rulers. He imagined that one last act of defiance would restore moral geometry, that if he simply proved the Selvari still capable of saying no, then history might blink and give him back his empire. Instead, his last refusal only made the final phase inevitable. Terran special operations units cut the palace from its own command web within an hour. The outer defense crews stood down in sectors where families had already negotiated private amnesty. The court guard fought hard and died harder. Archon Terov was taken alive in the hall of Three Tides beneath a fresco depicting the founding of the Dominion trade peace, which many later considered either tragic or very funny depending on their politics. He was not executed at once. That more than anything proved the elders right. A lesser species might have made him a spectacle and moved on. Humans processed him. They opened the archives. They walked the corridor dead into the public record. They brought children from the sanctuaries, now alive, fed, still frightened but no longer disappearing, to testify as witness presence before the worlds. They made every trade prince, every customs prefect, every clerk who had signed the starvation orders see the faces of those they had categorized as economic friction. The law never defied them, was never more visible than in those months after the shooting, because the punishment was not only military, it was historical. The humans did not simply defeat the Selvari Dominion. They made sure future students, smugglers, admirals, and ambitious young politicians would know exactly why it had deserved defeat. By then even the youngest species in the conquered had stopped laughing at the elders. Chapter 4: Why the Law Survived. 207 years later, students on conquered worlds still study the Selvari collapse in 3 different disciplines: strategic, history, refugee law, and preventable civilizational failure. That last category exists in large part because of them. The Dominion did not perish because it lacked power. It had fleets, wealth, industry, soft coercion, allies, and a refined internal mythology about why all those things naturally entitled it to continue. It perished because it encountered a law, understood it perfectly, and decided the law should apply to lesser minds. There is no cleaner example of intelligent self-destruction in the mid-conquered era. Many species suffered more, few taught a clearer lesson. The elders, for their part, did not celebrate this, disappointed younger observers who expected vindication to taste sweeter. Elder Mother Sarith had died before the war ended. Her final archive message, consisting only of a request that the sanctuary children be shown the tide gardens on Glass Tide if they ever wished to visit a world older than their suffering. Keeper had survived long enough to testify before the Reconstruction Accords, where he was asked whether the old law had been meant as admiration, fear, or warning. He answered it was meant as mercy toward the proud. The phrase became famous because it offended everyone equally. But it was true. The ancient species had not preserved, never defy them because they loved humanity or believed Terrans uniquely righteous. They preserved it because the galaxy already contained enough unnecessary graves. If one has seen the pattern clearly, one has a duty to name it before the next bright fool convinces himself history applies only to those less gifted than he. Humanity characteristically reacted with mixed feelings to all of this. There were factions that disliked the mythologizing. Some Terran scholars argued correctly that the law obscured human failures, internal contradictions, and the fact that humans had also defied one another to catastrophic effect across their own bloody history. Some veterans from the corridor campaigns hated the way the phrase turned hard, costly rescue work into something quasi-mystical. We weren't gods, one old transport commander said during an anniversary interview. We were just the people who showed up after someone touched the line. Others understood that civilizations rarely remember precise nuance, and that perhaps there were worse things for the galaxy to simplify about you than the fact that if you clearly marked a humanitarian sanctuary and someone starved children inside it anyway, you became a terrible enemy. The sanctuary corridors survived. That may be the most important part of the story, not the fleets, not the collapsed empire, not the law engraved into strategic culture, but the simple fact that the refugee roots the Selvari tried to squeeze into profitable desperation, remained open, and eventually grew into the largest protected civilian passage network in the outer conquered. The rebuilt stations carried names from the lost ships and dead medics of the war. Human crews served there beside elder species, corridor-born teachers, former refugees, and even descendants of those old mercenary houses who once refused the Selvari contracts because, as they bluntly put it, they preferred breathing. Children played in transfer domes under legal protections whose cold administrative wording concealed oceans of blood beneath them. In some sectors, the old line from the law was carved quietly above service locks or medbays, not as threat but as memory, never defy. Them travelers often misunderstood the inscription when they first saw it. They assumed it referred to the station, authorities, or perhaps some local founder cult around human intervention. The patient staff would correct them if asked. No, they would say it means something more specific. It means there are some promises humans make that they do not later negotiate around. Shelter is one of them. Children are one of them. Civilian corridors under their protection are one of them. If you challenge those things knowingly, the consequences may outlive your grandchildren's excuses. In the end, the law survived because it kept proving useful. Every few decades, some rising power, usually efficient and young enough to mistake speed for wisdom, would rediscover the old phrase and ask whether it still applied in the modern age. There would be seminars, debates, strategic papers arguing that humans had grown too entangled in governance, too bound by coalition law, too economically interdependent, too self-critical, too plural to respond as decisively as before. And always somewhere in the room, an elder historian or old frontier officer would ask the only question that mattered: which line exactly do you intend to test? At that point, the theorists usually became less certain, because ideas about human restraint remained comfortable only while abstract. Once attached to actual refugee domes, children's transports, colony shelters, plague ships, or evacuation lanes, the arithmetic starts to feel much less speculative. That was the true genius of the old warning. It did not claim humans were invulnerable, omnipotent, or morally pure. It claimed something more practical and therefore more durable, that there are specific acts of defiance for which human retaliation becomes so focused, so industrially sustained, and so socially coherent that only a fool would volunteer to discover whether this time might be different. And so the law passed onward from elder archive to classroom, from courtroom to military manual, from refugee station wall to merchant family warning, from amused proverb among those who did not understand it to strategic reflex among those who finally did. The younger species no longer laughed, or if they did so with the careful tone one uses near memorial fields and old machinery still carrying power, because the Selvari had tested the law in full view of the stars, and the stars, being old enough to have seen pride before, had answered exactly as the elders said they would.